The sky was drenched in darkness, visibility nearly zero. As soon as the signal was given, two soft gunshots echoed, and the guards crumpled to the ground. The gunfire continued sporadically for the next 15 minutes. Once everything quieted down, the radio crackled with a report. Building cleared. Ready for extraction. 14 years later, I stood by the window of a hotel room, staring at the sunset, reflecting on how it all started, and wondering how I'd gotten to this point. I took a sip of vodka, feeling it burn its way down, much like the memories that had resurfaced over the past few weeks. 6 weeks ago, I found out that my wife of 12 years was having an affair. It wasn't something I went looking for. Like many clueless husbands, it found me. Oh, by the way, my name's Mike. I met my wife, Sarah, back in our junior year of college. We dated until we graduated. I enlisted in the Navy, and she focused on her career hunt. Back then, I loved her, but I didn't want her tied down while I was stationed in some unknown corner of the world. So, 5 years later, after finishing my Navy service, I returned home. Within a few weeks, I landed a solid job with a large company in their sales department. My boss, also a former Navy man, liked hiring veterans. Military discipline really paid off, and I worked my way up quickly. During that time, I dipped my toes back into the dating world, mostly through online sites. And, lo and behold, there was Sarah, looking better than ever in her profile pictures. She wasn't a supermodel, but she had stayed in great shape. Sarah had always been into yoga and dance, and her toned, curvy body was a testament to that. Her long black hair and deep brown eyes always drew me in. That smile of hers could melt anyone. I immediately messaged her, and after a week, she replied. Her first question was, "Where the hell have you been all these years?" I figured her frustration meant she missed me, a promising sign. Before long, we were dating again, picking up right where we'd left off. Within a year, we were married, and a year later, our daughter Emma was born. Work was going well for me, though I had to travel more than I anticipated. 2 years later, our second daughter, Lily, came along. Life was good. We had a nice house in a great neighborhood, with top-rated schools. Sure, I was away for work a lot, sometimes 2 weeks each month, but it was part of the job. Eventually, Sarah started questioning when I'd slow down my travel. She didn't like being alone with the kids so often. I told her it wouldn't be long before I'd get promoted, which would cut down on my travel. She accepted that answer, though she wasn't thrilled when I had to leave again. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags. But I was in love and trusted my wife completely. The first sign was the small, petty arguments that began cropping up when I'd come home. She'd pick fights over trivial things, like blaming me for things that went wrong while I was away. "If you were home more, this wouldn't happen," she'd say. She had a point, but I didn't realize just how deep her frustration went. The second clue was more obvious. One day, while looking for a clean shirt, I found some new lingerie in the laundry. It wasn't Sarah's usual style. She typically wore comfortable pajamas to bed. The lingerie was sleek and silky, and I assumed she bought it for herself. I didn't think much of it at the time. The third sign was harder to brush off. Our intimate life had slowed down to almost nothing. She kept telling me she was tired or stressed, and I didn't want to push. I figured it would get better once I was home more. The final blow came when a friend of mine, Tom, saw her with another man at a farmer's market about 40 miles from where we lived. At first, he thought it was me, but when he got closer, he realized it wasn't. They were holding hands, laughing, and looking awfully close. Not wanting to make a scene, Tom followed them from a distance until they drove off together in a car. I'll never forget that phone call. I was just leaving a meeting when Tom called. He said he had something important to tell me. I was in between meetings and couldn't talk, so I told him we'd chat later. He agreed but sounded uneasy, asking me to call him as soon as I could. I didn't think much of it at the time. That night, I called him back. Hesitating at first, he finally told me what he had seen. Sarah, out with another man, holding hands and kissing. My stomach dropped. He apologized for having to share such difficult news and suggested that Sarah might be having an affair. Those words hit me like a freight train, leaving me numb. What would make him think that? We were happily married, or at least I thought so. She had no reason to cheat, right? But as I tried to finish that thought, All those small clues I had brushed off before suddenly clicked into place. Still, I resisted believing it. Tom's voice snapped me back to the present, reminding me that, as painful as it was, I needed to be aware of what was happening. He suggested there might still be hope to save the marriage and offered his support, telling me to reach out if I needed anything. I thanked him before ending the call. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I wrestled with whether this was some cruel misunderstanding or harsh reality. As anger simmered inside me, I kept replaying the conversation. Was my wife really cheating? By the time my flight home landed, I had calmed down a bit, trying to think logically about what needed to be done. Without solid evidence, I felt lost about where to even start. My first call was to Tom, asking for any details he had about the man she was with. No matter what happened, I needed to protect my daughters, Emma and Lily, from getting dragged into this mess. I wanted to find a way to save our marriage, if possible. Tom cautioned me not to do anything reckless. He mentioned a friend of his who had been in a similar situation and offered to connect me with him for advice. Tom emphasized the importance of not letting my emotions cloud my judgment, especially when so much was at stake. His words resonated, and I realized that I needed guidance from someone who had been through this. For now, Tom advised, go home and act like everything is fine. If she suspects you're onto something, it'll be much harder to figure out what's really going on. He was right. When I got home, I did my best to keep up the facade. Sarah and the girls greeted me, and I played along, trying to act normal. It was far from easy, but somehow I pulled it off. In the following days, I quietly searched the house for any clues about her affair, but nothing jumped out at me. Still, I couldn't shake the gut feeling that I was missing something. A few days later, Tom called again, urging me to meet with his friend, Mark. I agreed and made plans to meet them at a bar across town the next evening, telling Sarah I had late meetings. When I arrived, I found Tom and Mark in a back booth, nursing their beers. Mark looked like he had been through the ringer, and as soon as I sat down, I could sense this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Mark wasted no time. Having already been filled in on my situation by Tom, he began by empathizing with my pain but warned me against making the same mistakes he did. He shared how his own desire for revenge had landed him a 5-year prison sentence and cost him everything in a brutal divorce and lawsuit. His wife had an affair with her boss, and he went after both of them without thinking things through. Don't let anger guide your decisions, Mark said, his tone intense. I just nodded, absorbing his cautionary tale. Curiosity got the better of me, though, and I asked what he would have done differently. He admitted that he would still go after the man who had ruined his marriage, but he would have approached it more strategically, catching him off guard instead of charging in head first. Mark's bitterness was palpable, but his experience was a harsh reminder of how badly things could spiral. Our conversation shifted to practical advice. Mark emphasized that the first step was gathering undeniable proof of Sarah's affair. Without hard evidence, confronting her would be a disaster. The next step was talking to a lawyer to understand my rights and how to protect our assets in case things went south. Mark also recommended keeping some cash on hand, in case Sarah found out about my investigation and tried to freeze accounts. Finally, he advised me to secure a backup place to stay, like a small apartment, just in case I had to leave the house quickly. The advice made sense, but deep down, I still believed, or maybe hoped, that this could be resolved with a conversation. As soon as I mentioned that idea, Mark slammed his fist on the table. Don't be naive, he barked. Her new guy could be filling her head with lies. You need to know what she believes before you approach her. He drew parallels to my military background. You were in the Navy, right? He asked. Think of this like an operation. You need solid intel and a plan. Don't go in blind. You have to be prepared for things to go sideways. I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. Sure, I had been through tough situations in the Navy, but this felt different. This was my family. Sensing my struggle, Mark softened his tone, apologizing for being blunt. We sat in silence for a moment before Tom asked what my plan was moving forward. I took a deep breath, realizing that no matter what happened, I wanted to try and salvage my marriage. But more than anything, I needed to know the truth. I wanted nothing more than to make the other man suffer, but without risking my own freedom. It was clear that gathering proof and intel on my wife's lover was now my top priority. Mark grinned at that, appreciating my determination. He cautioned me against hiring a private investigator, mentioning how it had only drained his wallet with no useful results. Instead, he suggested I use the resources I already had, access to Sarah's bank and credit card accounts, phone records, and check for any unusual purchases or calls. He even raised the possibility of a second cell phone, and, uncomfortable as it made me, advised setting up hidden cameras around the house for visual and audio evidence. Despite my initial discomfort with the idea, I nodded in agreement. I was determined to make this man pay. We continued talking for another hour, with me mentally noting every suggestion Mark threw out. He emphasized the importance of keeping quiet about my suspicions at work, especially until I knew for certain who my wife's lover was. The last thing I needed was someone who knew my travel schedule getting wind of my plans. Mark shared how he would have approached things more subtly with his wife's lover, which sparked my resolve to come up with a clever plan. But first, I needed more information. The next day at work, I reviewed my upcoming travel schedule. I found a short, 2-day business trip coming up soon and began to think about how I could use that to my advantage. Discreetly, I approached my boss, Hal, and suggested extending the trip to a full week for more client meetings. He agreed without hesitation. With that said, the next step was to create the illusion of being away while secretly returning home to catch Sarah in the act. I used a prepaid debit card and bought a return ticket with a different airline, making sure to keep everything off the radar. I also ordered a set of spy cameras, along with a high-quality camera that had excellent zoom and low-light capabilities. This would be my first move, uncovering the identity of the man she was seeing. The second step would be to catch them in the act on camera, removing any chance of her denying it. My days became consumed with plotting out every detail. This level of meticulous planning was something I had always excelled at, but this time, it felt personal. The only missing piece of the puzzle was the identity of the man. Until I figured that out, I couldn't trust anyone, not even Hal or my closest friends. I knew this would take time, but I was resolved to see it through. By the end of the week, all of my spy equipment had arrived at Tom's house. I had to wait for the perfect opportunity to install the cameras without raising suspicion. The chance came that Saturday when Sarah and the girls left for their usual shopping trip with her mother. Once the house was empty, I got to work. After a few hours, the cameras were all in place, tested, and ready to go. I could now monitor everything in real time from my tablet or laptop. With the cameras set, I shifted my focus to searching the house for any clues. I started by combing through our credit card statements, looking for any unusual charges. Then, I inspected Sarah's closets, searching for new clothes that didn't fit her usual style. Though nothing screamed affair, I did find a short, tight red dress I'd never seen her wear before. That dress, so different from her usual attire, gnawed at me. I hated the thought of her wearing it for anyone else. Feeling frustrated, I needed to clear my head, so I laced up my running shoes and went for a 5-mile jog. Running always helped calm my mind and bring clarity. By the time I returned, sweat dripping from my brow, I spotted Sarah's car in the driveway. The sound of my daughter's laughter as I walked inside instantly lightened my mood, if only for a moment. Their voices always brought a smile to my face. "Hey, Dad." Emma and Lily ran up to me as I stepped through the door, eager to tell me all about their day. Sarah followed a few moments later, smiling as she kissed me on the cheek and asked about my run before shooing the girls back into the family room. After dinner, pork chops, one of my favorites, I took a long shower to wash away the day. We spent the evening watching TV as a family, but my mind was elsewhere, turning over the possibility of Sarah's infidelity. Unable to focus on the show, I excused myself for an early bedtime. In the bedroom, I noticed Sarah's purse sitting on the hope chest. Without thinking, I unzipped it and rifled through her belongings. That's when I found it, a cheap cell phone I'd never seen before. My heart raced as I powered it on. There was only one number in the call log that I didn't recognize, which I quickly wrote down before turning off the phone. That was it. I finally had proof. Sarah was having an affair. Crushed and angry, I recalled Mark's advice about not acting impulsively. I knew I had to be patient. I changed into my pajamas and pretended to be asleep when Sarah finally came to bed. I kept my mouth shut, avoiding any conversation that might give away my discovery. The next few days were tough. Acting normal around her, after what I'd found, felt like torture. But I had to play the part until I had everything I needed. Soon enough, it was time for another business trip. I went through my usual routine, packing my bags into the car. Just before heading out, I casually asked Sarah if she had anything special planned while I was gone. She shot me a strange look and mentioned the usual, nothing out of the ordinary. As I raced through different explanations in my mind, I bid her a quick goodbye and drove to the airport, wondering if the cameras I'd set up would catch anything. I hoped, deep down, that she'd at least have the decency not to bring him into our home, into our bed, though I was growing more certain that the woman I once thought incapable of cheating had crossed that line. A few days later, after wrapping up work with my client ahead of schedule, I packed up, preparing to return home earlier than planned. While waiting for my flight, I started monitoring the live video feeds from the cameras I had hidden around the house. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but I decided to review footage from earlier in the day. The system automatically recorded whenever someone entered the rooms with cameras, saving the clips for remote access. As I fast-forwarded through the recordings, I came across something that made my heart race. There she was, on that secret cell phone I'd found. I rewound the footage and watched it at normal speed. The audio quality was terrible, but I caught enough of the conversation. She called the person on the other end, baby. They talked about my trip and how they'd meet up discreetly at a motel while I was gone. My stomach turned as I watched her laugh, then turn her back to the camera, blocking the rest of the conversation. When she turned back, she continued with more instructions. She told him to park at a coffee shop down the street and walk over to the house. Okay, baby, I can't wait. See you tomorrow night, she said with a flirty smile. I couldn't believe what I'd just heard. Not only was she bringing him into my house, but into our bed. Thoughts of rage filled my mind, and I briefly imagined ending him right there. But then Mark's warnings came flooding back, reminding me not to do anything that would ruin my own life. I swallowed the fury and decided to wait. I needed to see this man with my own eyes. Who was he? Someone from work? A friend I knew? The flight back home felt far too quick, and I wasn't ready to face what was coming. Instead of heading straight home, I checked into a hotel nearby and plotted my next move. That night, I knew he'd be in my house. I had to see for myself who this person was. Without any idea what he looked like, I decided to stake out the coffee shop where he'd park, as Sarah had instructed him. I rented a car at the airport, blending in with the other vehicles, and found a spot where I could watch the coffee shop's parking lot from a distance. I brought my camera, checking its zoom to make sure I could get a clear shot of him and his license plate. Around 9 p.m., a sleek silver BMW M3 pulled into the lot. My pulse quickened as I began taking photos. The lighting was perfect, allowing me to capture a crystal-clear view of his face. I didn't recognize him. He parked away from the coffee shop and began walking in the direction of my house. I gritted my teeth and took deep breaths to stay calm. As he disappeared down the street, I switched on my laptop, using the coffee shop's Wi-Fi to tap into the cameras at my house. Minutes later, I saw him walk through my front door, and there she was, waiting for him. He greeted her with a passionate kiss. Suppressing the rage boiling inside me, I listened to their conversation. He told her how much he'd been thinking about her all day, and they discussed how they had the house to themselves until morning. Sarah had sent the kids to her parents' house for the night, and of course, I wasn't due back until Friday. How convenient. I watched as he started undressing her in the living room, their hands all over each other. She reciprocated eagerly, and within minutes, they were naked. The sight of it twisted my gut. She suggested they take things upstairs to the bedroom, and they ran out of view of the camera, laughing as they left their clothes scattered around the room. That was my cue. I got out of the car and quickly walked down the street to my house. As expected, they had left the front door unlocked in their rush upstairs. I slipped inside silently and went straight for his pants, which were lying on the floor. His wallet was right there, and I pulled it out, scanning the ID. Stephen Bannister. I now had everything I needed. Clutching his wallet, I headed to my home office on the first floor, far from the bedroom. I powered on the computer and scanner, my hands trembling with a mix of adrenaline and disgust. Once the scanner was ready, I copied his driver's license and other details, I needed this information as leverage, just in case. Before leaving, I grabbed my camera again and took several pictures of their discarded clothes, documenting everything. I then switched the camera to video mode and started recording as I quietly made my way upstairs. The sound of their lovemaking echoed down the hall, turning my stomach further. The bedroom door was wide open, and I could hear everything as I approached. When I stepped into the doorway, there they were, Stephen on his back, completely naked, with Sarah on top of him, locked in a 69 position. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't even notice me standing there. I stood frozen, watching in horror. The hidden cameras couldn't capture everything clearly, but I needed high-definition footage. I recorded several minutes of their affair, fighting the growing urge to grab a baseball bat and put an end to it right then and there. Mark's wise words echoed in my mind. Don't do anything stupid. Slowly, I backed out of the house and drove back to the hotel, my mind a tangled mess of anger and hate. I couldn't remember ever being this furious, and it was beginning to scare me. I called Tom and told him what I had done, including the information I'd collected. He acknowledged what I shared but expressed concern about the risks I was taking by being back in the house. Tom apologized for the situation I was in and offered any help he could provide. I thanked him, telling him I needed someone to talk to and that I planned to ask Mark for a favor. Tom agreed to set up a meeting with Mark over the weekend. As Mark had already mentioned, he was willing to help. After getting off the phone with Tom, I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. My thoughts raced, and the weight of what I'd seen kept me wide awake. In the early morning, I went for a run, hoping the physical exertion would clear my head and release some of the pent-up anger. It helped a little, but my emotions were still raw. After my run, I took a long shower and managed to catch a nap, trying to make up for the lack of sleep the night before. Later that day, I returned the rental car to the airport, picked up my own car, and headed straight to the office to check in. I needed to talk with Hal, my boss, about reducing my travel schedule. After closing the door behind me, I sat down and told him about my situation. I explained that Sarah had been pushing for me to be home more and that I needed to make some changes in how often I traveled for work. Hal listened carefully and then informed me that my promotion had been approved. With the promotion, I wouldn't need to travel nearly as often anymore. It was a huge relief, though I was still too preoccupied to fully appreciate it. My mind was overwhelmed with the knowledge of Sarah's betrayal. Hal noticed my distraction and asked if everything was okay. I felt compelled to tell him the truth. I confided in him about catching my wife with another man and even mentioned the recordings I'd taken. He reacted with shock and sympathy, offering his support. I explained that I needed to be home more to either save my marriage or prepare for a potential divorce, and I asked him to keep the situation confidential. I didn't want anyone at work leaking my schedule or anything else that might make it harder for me to figure out who was involved. Hal promised to cover for me if I needed time off and agreed to keep the situation quiet. I thanked him before leaving his office, feeling a small sense of relief that some things were falling into place, though deep down, I knew my marriage was on its last legs. That night, I went home and tried my best to act normal. As usual, my daughters, Emma and Lily, greeted me at the door with hugs and laughter. I held them close, fighting the urge to cry. The thought of how a divorce would affect them weighed heavily on me. I couldn't bear the idea of only seeing them on weekends or needing permission just to visit my own children. I knew I had to fight for custody if it came to that. On Saturday, while Sarah and the girls were out shopping, I met with Mark and Tom at a diner across town. I updated them on the progress I had made in gathering evidence. Mark looked at me with a mix of surprise and respect, remarking on my self-control. He admitted he thought I would have already taken more drastic action. He then asked how he could help, hinting at his own experience with revenge. Both Tom and Mark watched me with curiosity as I laid out my plan. I explained what I was hoping to achieve, particularly with Mark's connections, and how I intended to move forward. When I finished, Mark gave me a slow nod, clearly impressed. He mentioned knowing someone who might be able to assist me, though he cautioned that these types of people often expected payment for their services. He agreed to make a few calls and promised to get back to me once he had spoken with his contacts. I gave him my number and told him to reach out when the arrangements were in place so we could finalize everything. After we wrapped up our conversation, I realized I needed to make some additional online purchases to prepare for the next phase of my plan. The rest of the weekend passed quietly, with one major exception. Sunday night, Sarah and I usually had some kind of intimacy, but this time, she claimed she wasn't feeling well. It wasn't the first time she had made this excuse, but it had been over a month since we'd been close. The distance between us was becoming unbearable. The next business trip on my schedule was coming up soon, so I approached Hal and asked for the following week off. I told him that if anyone inquired at the office, they should be told I was on a normal business trip. He agreed without hesitation and wished me luck. When I informed Sarah that my upcoming trip would be longer than usual, she wasn't happy, but I expected that. I reassured her that once my travel slowed down, I'd be home more often. I even joked that soon she'd get tired of having me around all the time. She didn't laugh, though. Instead, she sighed and asked me to call her once I arrived at my destination. Her distant demeanor was unmistakable, and it left me with the growing certainty that our marriage was nearing its end. Not wanting to say something I might regret, I quickly left the house and drove to the airport. The meetings with my clients went well, and I was able to finalize the deal earlier than expected. This allowed me to fly back home a day ahead of schedule. Throughout the week, I kept an eye on the cameras, but the man didn't reappear at my house. However, I did see Sarah on her secret cell phone again, and I listened closely to her conversation. What I heard confirmed that this was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. As painful as it was to hear her plans, I knew this was my chance. I returned to the office, where the items I had ordered online were waiting for me. With Sarah's routine predictable, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I knew I could easily set up one of the devices I had purchased with minimal risk of being caught. Sarah went to the gym 4 times a week, and I knew her schedule well. I had access to her spare car keys, so I was able to place the tracker where she'd never find it. After that, I headed over to Steven's condo to see if he was home. His car was parked in the carport, so I assumed he was inside. I brought my camera, looking for any chance to catch a glimpse of him. Luck was on my side. Through his sliding glass doors, I saw him, and he wasn't alone. He was with another woman, and they were clearly involved with each other. They were kissing and touching like a couple, and I couldn't believe my eyes. This was too good to pass up. I quickly started recording a video of their little rendezvous. After a while, they left the condo together, and I followed them from a safe distance. They went to lunch, which gave me the perfect opportunity to plant the second tracker on his car. This was a bit trickier and riskier, but I managed to pull it off without anyone noticing. Now, all I had to do was wait, and that was the hardest part. Later, I received a call from Mark. He told me he had a friend who could assist with the next phase of my plan. We agreed to meet in my hotel room to avoid being seen together in public, considering the nature of what we were planning. When Mark arrived, he introduced me to Joe, a hacker who could help us. We sat down, and I spent the next hour going over the details of my wife's affair and my plans for revenge against Steven. I showed them the information I had gathered from Steven's wallet. Joe raised some concerns about the legality of what we were doing, and he wasn't wrong to question it. But after a bit of negotiation, I offered him $5,000 in cash for his help. He agreed but insisted on getting half up front, and the rest after the job was done. Our conversation shifted to gaining access to Steven's condo and getting into his computer. Joe used my laptop to check Steven's recent purchases, and that's when we hit pay dirt. He found 2 airline tickets to Las Vegas and a reservation for 5 nights at a hotel. It looked like Sarah and Steven were planning a getaway together. That sealed our decision to break into his condo. Joe asked if I knew whether Steven had an alarm system, but I wasn't sure. He promised to look into it and let me know. If there was an alarm, he warned, the price would go up. As the day of their planned trip approached, I checked the tracking devices I'd placed on their cars. Everything was working perfectly. I also checked the video feeds from the house, where I saw Sarah packing a small carry-on bag. The time was almost here. The day finally came. I monitored their movements from my hotel room as they made their way to the airport. I called Joe, and he agreed to meet later in the afternoon. He informed me that there didn't appear to be any visible alarm systems at Steven's condo, but he advised caution all the same. We met a few blocks from Steven's condo after sunset, the cover of darkness working in our favor. Joe had his laptop and a small messenger bag, and I had my camera ready. As we approached the front door, Joe knelt down and started working on the lock. It took less than a minute for him to pop the door open, and we slipped inside. We carefully checked for any signs of an alarm system, but thankfully, there were none. We made our way to Steven's computer, which was sitting out in the open. Joe immediately got to work. As he started hacking into Steven's accounts, I took out my camera and began recording a video of the condo's layout. "We need to leave everything exactly as we found it," I said quietly, and Joe nodded in agreement. While Joe worked, I searched the rest of the condo for anything incriminating. I went through Steven's mail, flipping through bank statements and credit card bills. I even ventured into his bedroom, recording everything. The place was immaculate, high-end furniture, expensive decor. It left me wondering what exactly Steven did for a living. Suddenly, Joe's voice called out from the living room. Jackpot! He had successfully hacked into Steven's online accounts and found his bill payments, credit cards, and bank details. I had brought a card reader, and Joe suggested we copy the information from Steven's credit cards. "We could max these out in no time," Joe grinned. As we discussed our next steps, Joe raised the possibility of draining Steven's bank account. "It's doable," he said, glancing up at me, "but there's a chance the bank might call to verify the transaction. Can we make it look legitimate?" I asked, still furious at the thought of what Steven had done. Joe nodded. "We've already got his social security number from his wallet, so we can bypass a lot of security measures." I took a deep breath, the pieces of my revenge falling into place. I couldn't help but chuckle at Steven's carelessness as I gave Joe the go-ahead. I was determined to inflict as much damage as possible. I suggested we drain his bank account right away and sabotage his credit cards just in time for his return from Las Vegas. Joe grinned, calling it a welcome home gift. He emphasized that we needed to be meticulous in covering our tracks to avoid any fallout. I reassured him that we were taking all necessary precautions. Our latex gloves were just the start. I went back to searching Steven's bedroom and didn't find much until I checked the back of his closet. That's where I found a shoebox filled with recordable DVDs, each labeled with a different woman's name. I dumped the contents onto the bed and started sorting through them. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but then I saw one that made my blood boil: Sarah. That idiot had recorded them together. I was still fuming over the discovery when Joe called me from the other room. He had found something even more disturbing. Steven wasn't just having an affair with my wife. He was involved in blackmail. Joe explained that Steven had recorded multiple women, likely without their knowledge, and the videos showed their faces clearly. Steven's face, on the other hand, was barely visible due to the way he positioned the cameras. According to the emails Joe had found, Steven was extorting these women for money, threatening to use the videos against them if they didn't comply. It was disgusting. Joe speculated that Steven preyed on vulnerable, married women with children, exploiting their fear of being exposed. Fueled by my own anger, I asked Joe if all the videos were on Steven's hard drive. He wasn't sure, but he guessed that the DVDs I'd found in the closet might be the only copies. I decided to gather them, just in case. After some digging, Joe managed to find Steven's backup drive. I instructed him to back up everything and wipe the laptop clean. I told him our plan wasn't just to drain Steven's bank account. We were going to destroy his entire blackmail operation. I also made it clear that I wanted to contact the women Steven had victimized and let them know they were no longer under his control. Joe offered to set up an email account from Steven's computer so we could reach out to these women anonymously. I agreed, and as he worked on that, I did one final sweep of the condo. Before leaving, I made sure everything was left exactly as we had found it. Joe wrapped up the computer work, and we locked the place back up before slipping out into the night. Back at the cars, I handed Joe an envelope containing the rest of his payment. "Thanks for all your help," I said, shaking his hand. Joe nodded, telling me to reach out whenever I was ready for the next phase of the plan. With that, he drove off, and I returned to my hotel, ready to continue with my scheme. That night, I called my in-laws to check on my daughters. My father-in-law answered the phone, and I greeted him cheerfully, asking about Emma and Lily and whether they were behaving. He assured me they were fine and mentioned Sarah's weekend trip with her friends. I pretended to be unaware of her plans and said I hadn't spoken to her yet, explaining that I wanted to make sure the kids were settled before I called her. From our conversation, It was clear that Sarah's father had no idea about her affair or the trip to Las Vegas. Afterward, I called the house, knowing she wouldn't be there, and left a message. When she didn't return my call after an hour, I dialed her cell phone. Again, no answer, so I left another message, telling her I was worried and had called both the house and her phone with no response. I added that if I didn't hear back from her within the hour, I would call her parents. 15 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Sarah. "Is everything okay?" she asked, sounding a little tense. She mentioned trying to call the house and not getting an answer. I told her everything was fine and that I had taken the girls to my parents' house for the weekend. Her tone was uneasy, and when I suggested we plan a night out together when I returned, she seemed hesitant. That only made me more suspicious. Trying to rattle her, I teased her a little, pressing her for more details. She claimed to be tired and hinted that she wanted to end the conversation. Reluctantly, I let her go, telling her good night and that I loved her. But beneath my calm words, the anger simmered. It was becoming harder and harder to keep it under control. That night, I barely slept. I woke up early and went for a long morning run, trying to shake the rage building inside me. Afterward, I took a long shower and then called the office, checking in to make sure everything was running smoothly. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I figured I was in the clear for now. Then came the call every parent dreads. It was the school. Emma had been injured and was being taken to the hospital. At that moment, nothing else mattered. I rushed to get dressed and headed straight for the hospital, my mind racing with worry. The school had tried calling the house first, but when no one answered, they called my work, which eventually reached me. I called the school back, and they told me that Emma had broken her arm and was being treated at the emergency room. As I sped toward the hospital, I tried calling Sarah's cell phone. When she didn't answer, I left a furious voicemail, screaming into the phone that if she didn't call me back within 15 minutes, my next call would be to a divorce lawyer. It took her an hour, but eventually my phone rang. I saw it was Sarah calling, but I rejected the call and stayed by Emma's side as the doctor set her arm in a cast. She was crying, asking for her mom, and I didn't know what to say to comfort her. It took some time, but she eventually calmed down. Once she was settled, I took her to her grandparents' house. My phone rang again, but I ignored it. After calming myself, I called a good divorce lawyer and set up an appointment for the following day. Sarah called once more, and this time, I answered. She greeted me with sarcasm, mentioning my supposed luck at the blackjack tables, and then dropped the bombshell. She had already contacted a divorce lawyer. Through tears, she threatened to use the video she had of me and Stephen together as evidence to gain full custody of our children. I stayed calm, reminding her of her absence while Emma was in the hospital, crying for her mom, while she was in Las Vegas with her lover. I tried to reassure her, telling her she could start a new life with Stephen and even have more kids with him if that's what she wanted. But she insisted it was me she loved and wanted to be with. Torn and conflicted, I ended the call, unable to deal with the emotional weight of it all. Afterward, I took Emma and Lily home, helped them pack some clothes, and brought them to my hotel, getting them their own room next to mine. Then, I called Sarah's father and told him about Emma's injury at school, explaining that, for now, we wouldn't be staying at home until some things were sorted out. My father-in-law was concerned and asked about what was going on between Sarah and me. I explained that we were having problems and suggested he talk to Sarah for more details. He promised to look after the girls until he was sure they were safe and well, though he clearly didn't understand the full extent of the situation. Still, he wished us the best and hoped we could resolve our issues. After that call, I reached out to my lawyer and gave him the go-ahead to start the divorce proceedings. Then, I contacted Mark and told him to proceed with our plan to ruin Stephen, max out his credit cards, empty his bank accounts, and destroy his credit. Later that night, Sarah called me again, this time in distress. At first, I didn't want to answer, but after receiving a text from her, I gave in. She tearfully explained that Stephen was blackmailing her, threatening to release videos of them together from Las Vegas. I responded coldly, reminding her that she had brought this on herself by choosing to have an affair. I hung up, knowing that she needed to face the consequences of her actions. She had chosen her path, leaving behind her home and family for her own pleasure, and now it was time for her to deal with the fallout. Once I had decided to end things with Sarah, I knew I needed to address her lover, Stephen. I called Mark and let him know that the divorce papers were being drawn up and would be served to Sarah in a few days. Meanwhile, I wanted to move my assets offshore to ensure they were protected. Mark questioned my decision, but I assured him I was done with Sarah and determined to make her pay. Mark suggested a change of plans and proposed meeting at 5 p.m. at a dive bar. We ended up talking for nearly 2 hours, hashing out the details of what would come next. Before we parted ways, I handed him a substantial envelope to cover his part in the plan. For the next 3 days, Sarah kept calling, but I ignored every single one. I wanted her to suffer for what she had done. Finally, on Friday evening, I got the call I had been waiting for, a video call. I answered. On the other end, there was a man tied to a chair, bloodied and beaten. A voice in the background said that Stephen had a message waiting for him. Stephen's eyes, full of fear, stared into the camera. The voice mentioned Stephen's recent trip to Tijuana and made sarcastic comments about the exhaustion he must be feeling. Then, the speaker alluded to Stephen's financial troubles, suggesting that his current situation would help him hide from the bank. The speaker went on, mentioning someone named Santiago and his special stew, which left a sinister implication. They hinted that they could have gone after Stephen legally for alienation of affection, but instead chose not to waste their time. The message ended with a goodbye to Stephen, stating that a man named Mr. Lopez would now be involved. The last time I saw Stephen, it was in his eyes, pure fear. That was what I called a good investment. Stephen was still alive when they lowered him into the blue drum filled with Santiago's special mix. No one ever heard from him again, and no one even asked about him. 7 months later, I was a free man. I had full custody of my daughters. I got to keep the house until both girls were grown, and then we could sell it and split the proceeds. There was no alimony, no child support. I wanted nothing from Sarah. She had visitation rights, but I made sure I only dropped the girls off and drove away. A year later, I started dating Lisa, who had once been Amy's school teacher. Amy seemed to enjoy Lisa's company even more than her mother's. I haven't decided whether or not to get married again. I'm taking things slowly this time,